Thank you, Mr. Jeffrey, for being with us. You are a quite popular person in Georgia. Especially, there are lots of interviews published by you and published about you. As far as we know, you had some connection previously with Saakashvili. You were kind of advisor or something like this. Can you remember that time, how it happened, and to describe this situation?
Well, it was kind of like a coincidence. I was editing articles for his mother, and also there was a journal of the U.S. Embassy for alumni of U.S.-sponsored programs. And one day, Guli Al-Hassani, his mother, asked Jeffrey, "Can you help Michiko?" And next thing I knew, I was rewriting a letter to George Soros to ask him for help. Saakashvili then was running for a member of parliament for the Vake district. And he told Soros how he wanted to bring democracy to Georgia and reform and fight corruption. And I, like so many others, believed him. But we know the rest of the story now. He was a very good actor.
So it was like before Rose Revolution?
But this was before the Rose Revolution. Then even after the Rose Revolution, I was working with International Crisis Group, as well as doing some work for the French Embassy. And they had asked me to look into the situation in Adjara with Hassan al-Rashid, all his options. And you remember Shemi Adjara movement, Adjara. And I found that soon that Saakashvili was just after the proceeds from the Sarpi customs, and he wanted to take over Hassan al-Rashid's business. So then there was 2004, with the first time there was a conflict between South Ossetia and Georgia. And so I quickly realized Saakashvili was not anything that he was pretending to be.
So how you can describe Saakashvili? Most probably you had some meetings.
Well, I had meetings. I was at Christmas dinners with him and Sandra, his mother, and his stepfather. And I respected the man at first. He seemed educated, but then I realized he was not what we thought he was.
So previously you also were working as a journalist.
Yes.
You had your own investigations as well, and you had some information about Lugar laboratory in Georgia. What can you say? Who owns this laboratory? It's under
Well, it's under the U.S. Department of Defense.
Even now?
Even now. I mean, back when I broke the stories, I obtained access to the design plan. Some of the people working there brought me information. They told me how people had died working there, some Filipinos.
Really?
And people had become sick, and how this was under the control of the U.S. Navy, as well as the Georgian intelligence services. Anna Zwani, who was the head of the lab at the time, or deputy, I forget, she was basically the head of Georgian security. So what is a person with no background in science in charge of what they were claiming to be a public and animal health?
There is no sign, yeah, and there is no logo, nothing. Yeah.
It's being presented to the Georgians as a health laboratory, but in Georgia they don't even test the blood.
But what do you think? For what it was established, or what is their main purpose?
Okay.
Yeah.
During the Soviet period, Georgia was a center of biological weapons research. Alexandria, near the airport, they had a repository of pathogens, viruses, bacteria. And the Americans found this out, and said they wanted to take control of these, and they claimed they were making everything safe, but they took control, but they started researching, and they also started researching into how to weaponize these agents. So the laboratory was basically constructed as a biological weapons laboratory.
And what could be their main purpose or main aims for the future?
Well, one, look at what's happening in Syria now. Look at what's happening in the Middle East. America is losing. And if you want to get to the oil, the easiest way is just to depopulate the region. And there's no better way to depopulate a region than through biological warfare. Look 100 years ago, the Spanish flu.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there is any connection between this different kind of lots of viruses we face recently in Georgia, and not only in Georgia, and in this laboratory?
Well, basically, Georgians are being used as white rats, as a population to be experimented upon. Even free vaccines produced by the U.S. military, Department of Defense, have been donated to Georgians. There was a measles outbreak 4 or 5 years ago, and by coincidence, this was a new strain of measles never seen before. Where did it come from? Also, look at the swine flu that hit Georgia and hit Russia, southern Russia. It started in Georgia. Rabbit fever also started in Georgia. Different strains of bird flu in Georgia. This is not by coincidence. And a lot of people are dying, but these people are not being reported officially as their real cause of death. Oh, they're old, they're sick. And also in Abastumani, they're using experimental drugs there. Also, there's a biological laboratory in Kutaisi as well where they're studying the Black Plague. So Georgia is the place where you can do things which are illegal under the Biological Weapons Treaty. Russian government is very well aware of this, and I've given interviews with Russian television on this many times, as well as Georgian television.
So you are a citizen of USA, yes. You are American, but very often you are criticizing US foreign policy and things related to America. What's the reason for it?
I know the history of my country. I teach U.S. foreign policy. I know what America's program is here in Georgia. I know the people who work in the embassy. I know where they worked before. My father's best friend went to Annapolis Naval Academy with Richard Miles, one of the former ambassadors. I know from my personal family even the history of these people. The people who come to Georgia to work are not the very best people. They are not here for friendship. They're here to do a job, and that is to use Georgia for the benefit of American foreign policy, not for the benefit of good relations between Georgia and the United States.
And what USA's program? You said you know about the program. What kind of program do they have for Georgia?
Well, basically, the U.S. needs bases. It would love to put missiles in Georgia, like what it had in Turkey at one time. It would like for Georgia to be an area where people ask no questions and Americans can do anything they want. It's conveniently located to the Middle East. It's conveniently located to Central Asia, Iran, Iraq, and also the Russian Federation. And also it's a good place to control the Black Sea. I was in Batumi 2 days ago. There was a warship from a Romanian Navy docked in Batumi. Did you hear anything about that on Georgian television?
No.
No. NATO ships are making port calls here in Georgia, and the Georgian people are not even aware.
And what kind of material do they have? Most probably, so like warship, like.
Well, I know from my previous investigations, often weapons are brought to Georgia through Porti and Batumi, intelligence gathering, but they're checking out. Georgia is a potential forward operation base for NATO.
When you decided to come to Georgia, how did you heard about Georgia, and when you started your journalism career?
No, I came to Georgia in 1991 by accident. I was working for the U.S. government. I was a tobacco inspector. I met a man in North Carolina, and he was speaking German. I started speaking to him in German. Next thing I knew, I was offered a job to grow tobacco in Georgia. That was 1991, all through 92, 93, those difficult years. Then later, I lost a job because I reported corruption in an NGO, United Methodist Committee for Relief. I found out that U.S. government money was being used to buy weapons for Chechens. In America, they were calling them freedom fighters. Russia, they were calling them terrorists. So America was supporting freedom fighters with, through the NGOs. So that's when I became a journalist. And my friend Roddy Scott, who I was working with, a British journalist, he was killed over this investigation, and I was beaten up in Azerbaijan the next day. So by coincidence, I came to Georgia. And by coincidence, I became a journalist.
How we can describe Georgia and Georgians, because you are staying and living here almost like
Georgians
25,
are very
26 years.
Yeah. Georgians are very cultural, very rich history, very friendly, very tolerant. Unfortunately, some of the best Georgians are no longer in this country. They're escaping because in government and organizations, no one wants educated people. The culture is being destroyed, the education is being destroyed. If you turn on television now, you find entertainment programs, and Georgians don't even know what's going on in their own country anymore. And Georgians during the Soviet period, they were always wanting the truth, they were always seeking high education. Now it's the opposite. So what it means to be Georgian, many Georgians are starting to forget. I respect this country very much, and that's one of the reasons I stay here, and I will probably stay here the rest of my life.
What can you wish to Georgia and Georgians, I mean, in terms of economic and political policy, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of our relationship with European Union, in terms of our relationship with NATO and so on?
Well, first thing, Georgians have to first form a domestic policy. They have to restore their culture, they have to restore their education, and stop listening to all these countries that are telling Georgians what to be and why they should be Europeans. Georgians need to be first Georgians, and if they look at the history, you know, I don't even know what is a European, but Europeans have enough of their own problems. The European Union is not democratic. Why would Georgians want to be part of something that was so undemocratic and so against Georgian culture in terms of their own identity and what's best for Georgia?
Thank you so much.
Okay, very welcome. Bye.